So welcome everyone to episode 25 of Ethics TV. I'm joined by David Gunkel, who I've spent the last few minutes basically thanking for joining because as a far more published author than myself and more widely spread content creator on these topics, this is a conversation where I'm excited to get some perspectives on. But David, the starting point really, apart from saying thank you for joining, is can you perhaps tell us, and your bio is already below this video, in any description on any channel you can see the bio and links to your website, so we don't need necessarily the CV side of things, but what is it that's keeping you so busy at the moment?
Right. So right now, what's keeping me busy is generative AI, obviously, and especially large language models. But like everything I do, I don't tend to follow the standard approaches or common sense wisdom that seems to be circulating. So the common sense wisdom about large language models is that they're stochastic parrots. They don't know what they're saying, and therefore we shouldn't trust them. And everything is right about that except the conclusion. And that's because I think large language models really are a technology that operationalizes Derrida's deconstruction of logocentrism. These are things that write without speaking, and therefore they circulate words without knowing what they're saying, and nevertheless, there's a certain way in which those words make sense. And so I like to apply a lot of post-structuralist literary theory and deconstructive philosophy to try to reposition large language models, not so much as an interruption of a sort of Aristotelian understanding of language as sign referent, looking more at large language models as operationalizing, for example, what Wittgenstein had said, that my language is the limits of my world. Large language models, the limit of their world is the language we feed into them, and they have no external access to a reality outside language. Language is their reality. But I think that's a good thing. I think it's a strength that can tell us a lot about language, about how we think about thinking, and what we think about human communication. And so rather than using the sort of standard approach to critiquing large language models and saying they don't use language like we do. Well, yeah, they don't, but maybe they might help us understand what language use really is and open some doors for us to be a little more critical about philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, and all of these ways of thinking that we've inherited in the last 2 millennia.
I see. And so for those watching, there is the entire rabbit hole that David has illustrated an opening for is one of philology, study the structure of language and meaning, and something that I find fascinating, not least in that the way that we use words from a etymological perspective is so incredibly important, but yet is something that in this day and age, especially in the abbreviated micro billboarding of smart devices, seems to be more phoned in as opposed to thought of. But so what I see is that the large language model reality is the language model itself, and so could you extend that then to say that risks that we may fear are present in generative AI, let's say, or let's say AGI, to broaden it slightly. Would one be oversimplifying things to assume that there is any cross-pollination between what may be abhorrent behavior or, let's say, malevolent practice from a machine into a world where we have more than just a language as a reality?
So I think when you're looking at bad outcomes, whether it be bias that is generated by the generative AI system or the hallucinations that have gotten a lot of traction recently, it's not because the AI is making a mistake. The AI can't make a mistake. It can't tell the truth, but it also can't lie. It can't be deceptive because deception requires a pretense to want to present something that is different than what truly is the case. they don't exist in that well understood way of thinking about the way we use language, the way we communicate, and the kinds of games we play in social interaction with each other. They are just trained on very large amounts of language, in the case of a large language model, basically everything they've scraped off the internet, and they are just big language remix machines. And so the same way that you can't fault a DJ for a beat that he has sampled or she has sampled from a previous recording, you can't fault the large language model for just recirculating things that are found in this training data. What makes the things powerful is that it turns out that our language is highly probable. We think about language use as expressing meaning. And when something doesn't express meaning, there must be something wrong with it. But it turns out that language can be understood at the level, a much more material level, and a much more surface level of things, with regards to the sequences of words. Certain word sequences, like "this is a meaningful sentence," seemingly mean something to us. Other word sequences, like dishwasher, car, outside, dog, dish, is almost nonsensical. So one sequence of words has a higher probability of occurring within our everyday language use. The other one does not. And large language models just figure out which are the most probable sequences of words. And when we prompt them, they just start stringing words together. And they just do it based on word dependencies, one word after another, and make sentences that sound probable. Now, do they say something out there about the world? No, that happens on our end as readers. We're the ones who read those words and say, oh, it's talking about this thing out in the world. It doesn't have the world. I do as a reader. So I think we're expecting the originator of the language to do something it can't do. And when we make sense of the text that is spit out by a large language model, it's because of what happens on the side of reception, with us as the reader, the viewer, the listener, the interlocutor with the large language model. So I think as long as we are playing by a very Aristotelian semiology, we're going to miss what really is important about these things. And I think what opens up a whole new way of thinking about not only language, but also about technology and its relationship to language.
So would you say that the claims of machines are thinking for themselves would be potentially an overstatement of capabilities, and potentially, I mean, my most recent guest a few guests ago would say that it is actually a misunderstanding of what thinking means to say that machines think. What's your view of a statement from a Sam Altman or an Elon Musk of an artificial intelligence that not only is thinking for itself, but it's smarter than humans? What do you say to them?
So let me give you a very glib response, and then a much more grounded, historically organized response. The glib response is, how do we know what thinking is?
That's right.
But
yeah.
We say that it doesn't think. Okay, then what is thinking? Like, what do we do when we think, and how do we think it is different from what other things don't do? We used to think animals didn't think. We used to think animals didn't have emotions, right? Because they didn't do things the way we did. And that's because we brought our anthropomorphic and our anthropocentric way of understanding thinking and said, well, this is what we do. They don't do that. Therefore, they must not be thinking. I don't think we know what we mean when we say thinking. I think thinking is one of those umbrella terms that gets thrown around in ways that is a little loose and less rigorous than a lot of scientific terminology.
Yeah.
The more historically grounded version of this is Alan Turing's problem back in 1950 with computing machinery and intelligence. Remember, Alan Turing starts that paper by saying, I want to answer the question, can machines think? And he says, well, that means we have to be able to define what thinking is. And we can't, because it's loose and not very rigorously defined. And so what Turing does, and this is a rather clever move on his part, and he learns it from Kant, I think, because Kant also does this. Turing says, well, my research question, can machines think, I can't answer. So at that point, his paper should be over, right? But it's not, because what he does is he said, okay, I'm going to ask a different question. So he does a bait and switch. He says, this is my research question. I can't answer it, so let's pick a different question.
Hmm.
And the different question is what he calls the imitation game. And the imitation game is not about deciding whether something is thinking or not thinking. It's about behavior. And it is about whether a machine can behave using language in such a way that it's indistinguishable from a human user.
Mm.
And the reason we do this is because of this other minds problem. We
Mm.
don't know what happens in the head of another entity, whether it be another human, a non-human animal, or a machine. And therefore, things like thinking, things like emotion, things like consciousness, things like intelligence are only able to be benchmarked by external behavioral markers that we have decided are caused by thinking. But that's a yes. And
Hmm.
so when Turing tries to answer the question, can machines think? He switches the question up and says, can machines behave in social circumstances with behaviors that look like the kinds of entities that we say think?
Mm. And isn't that such a specific and useful contrast to what the normal assumption would be, where if a machine fools someone into thinking that it's, let's say, not a machine, we conflate that with, therefore, the machine is able to think like a human. But
Yeah,
that conflation is an ascriptive causality at best. There's no, that you would have to ignore a whole load of hidden evidence to come to the conclusion that a display of a behavior therefore means it's the same as if you say I see this with pet owners, and they
yes,
say, oh yeah, my dog understands what, oh, it's time for bed means, and I'm like, well, so when you say it understands it's time for bed, do you mean that it performs a set of actions that have been trained on a form of sonic kind of
right.
or do you mean that it actually understands the vowels and consonants to be from the Latin origin? So there's a I think this is an important distinction to make. And do you watch and read the news, the artificial intelligence news, with I would imagine some form of skepticism, to wonder whether the people who are running these 9-figure corporations, 10-figure corporations, seem to actually understand um, what they even are saying, or are you more generous to say that behind the scenes there's probably some people with letters after their name who are quietly reminding the chief exec from time to time that no, we're not actually creating something that thinks. It looks like it does, but you keep going. I mean, how generous can we be about that?
So I find reading that stuff to be really entertaining
Okay.
and informative, because what I find happening is all these rational men of science and these CEOs and people with the letters behind their names, when they start talking about this stuff, they start replaying Western metaphysics. Like they go back to Plato and they start. So I actually call a lot of these people Socratic parrots, because all they do is parrot Socrates. All
Yeah.
they do is reproduce what Plato has Socrates say in the Republic, in the Phaedrus, in all these other dialogues. And for good reasons. I mean, this has been a standard way of thinking for 2 millennia. And so they're channeling cultural expectations and understandings of mind, of thought, of intelligence, of communication, of language. But it's not surprising that when they do this, they are parroting very old ways of thinking about these things that go back, centuries, if not millennia. And so for me, it's really interesting to sort of track who's channeling what at what time, because that I find to be really informative.
Yes, I feel I hadn't officially noted that that's what I think I've been doing, but that seems to be right. There's an internal score chart in my head that has no official structure, where it's almost like bullshit bingo, where you kind of, when you're speaking to someone in advertising and you wait for them to say the words ecosystem, through the line advertising, one-to-one communication, yeah, and it's like so and it's interesting because on I test to, or rather, I posit that machines that involve our personal data should be under our own agency. And so my personal
Oh,
life's
right.
mission is to create, help create part of, even a modest part of, self-sovereign technology, a suite of self-sovereign technology tools.
It's interesting you mention this because there's a legal team of two brothers in France, Jeremy and Ellen Bensoussan. And around 2017, 2016, they wrote in French, it's never been translated, but it's a book they wrote in French called, now in French, it is either the rights of robots or the law of robots, because droit is either law or right? So one of their proposals is that any robot or AI in the home should be given the right of privacy.
Mm-hmm.
And that should belong to the robot.
Yeah.
And their reason for saying this isn't because they think the robot's a person and it's got to be protected, whatever. It's because they think the robot needs to be insulated from the surveillance of the multinational corporations that own the clouds on which these things depend. And that the only way the user would be able to do this, because the terms of service and the end user license is never adequate for privacy protection. It's terrible. Whether it's a platform for social media or whether it's a social robot. So their end run around this, their way to get behind all this and have a better legal structure is to say, well, let's give the right to the robot. And therefore, the robot can't divulge things because it has a right to privacy.
Would that right be a byproduct if the law was that the robot was a 100% subservient machine to the human, and therefore the human would then adopt the agency of where data can transport in and out? And so it would, because I'm wondering this, not to advocate too heavily the point of self-sovereign technology, but I try, the argument I'm trying to prove or disprove in my hypothesis here is that if our technologies are self-sovereign to us, the ones that involve our private information, not only would that adhere to the first of the 30 plus clauses of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights,
right,
but also that it would superimpose any form of need for laws of robotics, including but not limited to Asimov's laws, the 3 and the 0, because those laws are required when there is an arbitrary usage of information and instruction by who knows who guards the guards, who's programmed the programs. Whereas if we are the guard and we guard ourselves and we are the self-sovereign dictators of the robot, my hypothesis is that, for instance, giving a robot privacy would not be needed because you could in fact give the robot privacy if you so wanted, but to give it privacy so that it was private from the big tech oligarchs wouldn't be required if you were the person that was. That's the long form answer. The answer, to do it in reverse to yours, is that's awesome that there's people talking about robots having rights. I just wish that humans had the same rights in modern day technology.
So I think we have to differentiate what we. So again, I think rights is one of these umbrella terms that means a whole lot of things to a whole lot of different people, and we need to sort of break things apart a little bit to get a better understanding of what we mean by rights. So one of the problems is that we oftentimes don't distinguish adequately between natural rights and legal rights. So natural rights are the kinds of rights that are granted by a divinity, God-given rights, right? Or the rights that come from species identification as being a human being. Human rights are a natural right. You get those rights because you're born human. And that's generally the way the West has thought about the natural rights of human beings. There are, however, legal rights. And legal rights originate in a very different way. Legal rights happen because we're trying to fit something into our current legal system. And the way that we do that is we assign them rights and responsibilities. So corporations are persons with rights and responsibilities, not because they're dignified with God-given rights the way that we are, but because we need to be able to sue them. And in order to sue them, they have to be persons. Otherwise, they're property, and you can't sue property. So they're persons under the law. So we make these kinds of arrangements to fit things into our legal system, and we grant rights based on that. And those are not natural rights, those are legal rights. So the right of privacy would most likely, in the case of the robot, be a legal right and not a right similar to the privacy that a human being might have under natural rights. And I think breaking that out and understanding where the line is between those is very important. But I'll give you another really interesting example here where this is actually more real than we think it is. So right now in the US, robots actually do have rights. And that sounds weird because this sounds very science fiction to us. And it sounds science fiction to us, again, as long as we think about this in terms of human rights and natural rights. Yeah, robots can't vote and all those other great things that we have as human beings. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about very mundane, sort of everyday legal practices and pragmatic solutions to novel circumstances. So in 14 jurisdictions in the US right now, these delivery robots that roll around in college campuses and elsewhere and bring food and coffee to people when they order from their phone, there was a problem that the Starlink people who make these things realized, is that when these robots are on the street and they're in a crosswalk, there may be a situation where a car blows a light or a stop sign and hits the robot. And that's a traffic accident. Well, in a traffic accident, you have to figure out who had the right of way in order to assign liability for the accident. Is it the liability? Is it the driver who has the liability? How do we assign liability in those circumstances? So the Starlink people worked with legislatures in Virginia and in South Carolina and Pennsylvania, and they put in the books a law that says when the robot is in the crosswalk, it has all the rights and responsibilities of a pedestrian. Now, that doesn't mean that the robot is a pedestrian. It doesn't mean that the robot is like a human pedestrian. It just means that when you have an accident and you've got to assign right of way, we've got to fit the current law to fit novel circumstances. So we extend the right of pedestrian to the robot to protect it in those circumstances. So it's not a big decision about robot personhood. It's not, granting the right for robots to marry or vote or other crazy crap like that. It's just how do we solve a real everyday problem? And so this is how the robot invasion happens. The robot invasion doesn't happen by the robots taking up arms and declaring that they want to be free from their human masters. That's science fiction. That's RUR. That's Blade Runner. That's Battlestar Galactica. That is the Humans TV program. It's all of our science fiction. And it's dramatic and it's really fun. But the actual way in which the robot uprising happens, the way that robots get rights, looks more like a really boring episode of Law and Order. That we have to solve problems in a court case with a robot, and we bend the law to fit the current circumstance with this novel entity. And over time, more and more bendings and reconfigurings and shapings of the law to fit these novel circumstances is going to happen, and we're going to find that robots have more and more legal protections, rights in the legal sense, and some responsibilities. And that is going to be just a matter of us making these things fit in our social world and be accommodated by our legal practices.
For those watching and listening who are fascinated by that type of let's say thought experiment, an extension could be that if the robot that is crossing the road gets mown down by a car that's jumped to the stop sign, to David's point, the extension could be that if they are, let's say, carrying something personal to a or even an actual person with them, and they try and avoid the car that's jumped the stop sign, and by avoiding the impending doom of the car that's jumped the stop sign, they in turn injure someone else. Then one could argue from litigation's perspective that the person who was injured then sues the robot for the damage, and therefore in fact rather than the robot's owner. Now, is the robot's owner the person who bought it from a manufacturer, or is it the manufacturer, or does the manufacturer hand over the ownership in terms of legal responsibility to the
Right.
and this is the rabbit hole in which we end up. And there's very, very old world philosophical experiments around this. I think one of which comes to mind was about the family who had tied, there's a train coming and you're on a bridge and you know that you can, do you let them die, or do you jump? And there's lots of thought experiments around this and liabilities, and one of the, I mean, a lot of my family are lawyers, so I think probably it's kind of rubbed off. But from your perspective, I'm aware of the books, of the 17 books that you've had published, and one of them, of course, at least one of them covers the points that we're talking around, the what the actual invasion looks like, which I think is a wonderful metaphor, or analogistic to a boring episode of Law and Order. But do you know of if you were to summarize what ways in which we could mitigate the risks of a more dystopian outcome of that gradual seep into society? Should we be taking it all more seriously now and create preemptive frameworks, or something else? What's your view?
Yeah, I think I think one of the ways people have responded to a lot of the things I've written and described is to say, yeah, okay, this all sounds interesting. It's sort of science fiction-y. Let's just wait and see what happens, because I think you're getting far out in front of yourself here. And, maybe the robots will have to have rights at some point, but 20, 30 years from now, so let's wait and see. I don't think we can wait and see. I think we have to get out in front of this now and start to understand what the opportunities are, but also what the big challenges and what the risks are. And we need to do so for two reasons. One is a lot of the things that we decide now on a very small scale will have very big impact downstream. And I think corporate personhood is a really good example of this. The way we got corporate personhood is we were trying to solve a problem in the 19th century with the growth of the corporation and trying to fit them into our legal systems, and personhood seemed like the way to do it. But now we see all kinds of abuses around corporate personhood, and people asking themselves, maybe what we did 100 years ago or 150 years ago was not the brightest thing we could have done. And we maybe needed to think a little better back then about what possible futures could be. And I think we should learn from that. We should say, just because something solves a problem right now and seems very easy and very commonsensical, doesn't mean it has the need to be debated. And
yeah,
actually,
I think using heroin as pain relief was a great example of that. It's yes, it definitely relieves pain.
Yeah, it's really good.
So yeah, it is. I think we do. It's interesting, since the dawn of innovation in humanity, let's say fire on demand, for want of a better one, we end up in this strange situation where almost always, and I can't seem to find an example where the pattern breaks, but history tends to rhyme rather than repeat. So
right.
Nonetheless, we tend to, this is fire on demand. The first thing we did, burn ourselves, burn each other, burn our caves, and gradually over millennia, let's say, that it's kind of like, well, let's control this fire. Sure, it democratizes power, because you can then be an army with one 5'2" person with the ability to create fire, means that you then beat 1,500 people with sticks, no problem. But then we gradually, over time, we seem to always have to catastrophize the innovation so that the order can come from it, as opposed to see from a consequential analysis to begin with, kind of like looking at the scenarios and playing the tape forward, spooling it forward, right, and going, we want to avoid those kind of scenarios. We don't seem to, as humans, despite being so smart, have this consequential analysis, especially when there is shareholder price at stake.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And this is the other reason that we have to get out in front of this, if we don't get out in front of it, you can bet the large multinational corporations that build these things are going to be already there lobbying for their interests. And if we are to be democratically involved in the way the law is evolving and help shape laws that really have our interests in mind, we have got to join that conversation sooner than later. If we wait, we may find that the lobbying efforts of Google and Amazon and Meta and everybody else has already gotten there before us and has the ear of the lawmakers. Now, that may still happen, but if we're to have a chance of even having any influence here, the sooner we're there, the better. And that's what we have to do this now.
I agree. And I think the alternative is the eventual mass class action that happens that we then have to, bring the catastrophization forward into litigation to somehow swerve a regulator's attention, who then is re-lobbied to. I mean, I've been through all of this with GDPR and data protection acts and stuff. I mean, that the reason for your cookie bars that you have to click on your website right now is that's the watered down version of what people like me were campaigning for. But we entered the room 15 years too late. So the room that we entered to campaign for data protection had already been, painted by the large technology companies.
Yeah, correct. I mean, in my mind, I mean, you're exactly right about this. Right now, every single online platform that we use has a contract called the Terms of Service. It's a contract of adhesion. You either play by their rules or not. It's really a terrible way to protect people's use and rights and data. Nevertheless, we're saddled with it because that was put in place before anyone ever said, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should think about our privacy.
And funny enough, some of us did say that, but the feedback that I got is not dissimilar to the feedback that you get when people go, yeah. This is something for 20 or 30 years time. I mean, I used to I used to pay to go and speak at conferences about this because I wasn't going to be paid to be there, and I couldn't be there. I wasn't a sponsor, so I'd actually bribe organizers to go and speak about these things at a conference. And I spoke at dozens and dozens and dozens of events and got laughed off stage several times, but mainly I was an audience clearer. So there's a video online which I won't highlight, I won't point anyone to, but one of the videos of me speaking online in Amsterdam, I'm speaking, and you can visibly see the majority of the audience walking out in the first kind of 25 minutes, because when I would raise these topics to technologists, they thought that I was at best mad, like literally I'd lost my mind, but at worst they thought I was actually attacking the infrastructure. And it's not a great look to say that the emperor's not wearing any clothes. It's dangerous. And so I've become less combative in my maturity, because I feel that there's a more pragmatic way of raising these topics, and one of which is ethics TV. It's the purpose of this show, and because I could stand on stage and go, finger pointy, but I think there's more. I think my role should be in amplifying the voices and the conversations, and building technologies accordingly. In my case, the one itself. But in your view, then, bearing in mind we are in violent agreement in terms of being in part of the conversation as early as possible, what should we do next to join that conversation, or what are you doing to enable that to be something that we can be involved with from a democratic standpoint?
Yeah, so for myself, I think the way this has evolved, a lot of the early work I did and a lot of the writing and books I published are really quite academic. And that's because that was what I thought my audience was. And what I've realized, I've got to say, maybe too late in my own career, but at least I realized it, is that there needs to be a much more public-facing aspect to this. And therefore being on podcasts like this is one effort in that direction. But I would say that the most recent books I've written have been much more designed as accessible to a general reading audience, not just for undergraduates, but for people who are not even in school anymore and just want to, know something. So, for example, the book AI for Communication, it's like 140 pages. You can read it in a weekend, and it costs like $20. And the idea is to have something that people who wanted to know something about the impact of AI on the field of communication and communication studies and all, the language, the whole deal. Where could they go to get a really quick and easy entry level understanding of what it's all about and why it's important? The book I just did with Mark Cockelberg on communicative AI on large language models is the same sort of thing. It's a short book designed to be very readable, very accessible. For me, a lot less citations. I tend to be rather encyclopedic with my citations. I like to read. I like to find stuff, and if I can find connections to things that happened years ago, I like to weave it into the whole thing, and it's kind of a obsession of mine. But I recognize that it makes the reading really dense.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, that's a big ask. And so I think I've realized more recently, I need to have things that speak directly to where people are at right now. And maybe we'll get them into the more heady stuff later. But I've done the heady stuff. Now it's my chance to open this up and make for greater accessibility to these ideas in ways that someone who is not going to be a professional academic or a lawyer or some sort of practicing AI ethicist, just somebody who is, I don't know, my sister who's a dermatologist, she doesn't want to read a whole lot. She just wants to know, what might AI do in her field? So these are things that can help inform the average reader. And I'm doing more and more of that kind of writing and more of that kind of speaking. And it's a real challenge because you really have to parse your words very carefully, and you've got to package things in a very neat, accessible way. And one way I trained myself to do this is I took on a task that I initially thought was going to be dreadful. I occasionally contribute radio op-eds to the local public radio station, and they have to be 90 seconds. And I have to say my piece in 90 seconds. So it's like an elevator talk. Having an academic say something for 90 seconds is absolutely torture. But, just doing it again and again and again, like lifting weights, eventually it isn't a strain. And you realize there's a way that I can do this.
I find that a practice that I didn't come naturally to me either. I call it the bikini method. There's so much to cover, and in those instances you literally just need to cover the most important bits. But I must admit that practice has been tough. But when I wrote my fifth book, that became a Sunday Times bestseller and was well known around the world, called Powered by Change, that was the moment for me. It was 2018. It was the moment when I was asked to do a 90-second vignette on what the book was about, or a 9-hour lecture at Oxford about the topic. And so going from 90 seconds to 9 hours for the space of maybe a 2-year book tour was so now, even though I haven't spoken about the book for quite a while, if someone said to me, give me a 30-second, 60-second, 90-second, like 1-hour version, I could give you the topic matter, the conclusions, all the every version, because it's muscle memory. You get to a stage, and I feel in closing what I'd like to ask you, which is a bit of a lateral question, because it's slightly more, it's the same question as the one just asked, but in a more lateral way. So you and I would possibly say that the impact on regulation, legislation that large technology incumbents could have, that may well be going on at the moment or shaping itself at the moment, may require more than us doing our bit in terms of accessible content. Is there a framework, a committee, a group task force that that you've been part of, or joining, or thinking of constructing, that you feel would have the most chance at having an impact in those conversations?
Wow, this is a really good question, and it pushes me in a much more political direction than I normally work. And what I've been saying recently about this is that many of the things that we think are AI problems aren't really AI problems. They're just good old capitalism problems.
That's right.
And we're trying to regulate the AI, but what we should be focusing on is regulating corporate profit and power. And that is where I think the US in particular really doesn't have its eye on the ball, because we have eroded all the regulations that put a check on corporate power with an interest of protecting individuals and creating democratic opportunity. And it's that area that I think has the greatest possibility for impact. I think if we stop trying to apply ethical principles to AI and saying maybe we need to apply ethical principles to corporate power and greed, we'd have a better outcome. So I think we're focusing on effect and not a cause. And I think we got to start to focus on the cause.
I could not agree more. It just so happens that that is where I've reached as well, and there is, and in that point there is one power play, David Goliath, tug of war situation, and my view is that is of looking at the battery power behind that capitalist infrastructure. That battery power turns out to be humans, and inside that turns out to be human data. And that's the if you were to, I have to be careful about what I say here, if one were to look at the place on the body that is the most fruitful to address, the Achilles heel of the technology firms is that they are powered almost exclusively by human behavior.
Yes.
And therefore I believe that the addressment would be in how we can adjust human behavior and our subservience to the terms of services. I'm talking in abstract terms so I can remain broadcastable. But there is a relatively straightforward signpost there that makes sense. David, I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I suspect that you and I will be, we're inadvertently connected for the fullness of time because we're in the same space. But I'm really, really grateful for you joining. This has been a tremendous use of 45 minutes.
No, thank you. It's been really nice talking with you, and it's always nice when you find like-minded people in this domain. And so I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you. And for anyone watching or listening, please go to Gunkelweb, GUNKELWEB.com for all of the things that we've referred to. And David is way too modest to say this himself, but please do access his content and see what he's up to and the incredible work and body of work that he's done. I feel as if we really hit a jackpot having you on the show. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.